but it doesn't.
I know.
Yeah. It ends up being someplace.
But it doesn't mean it goes.
Are we good?
I feel like that's what's helpful.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Good morning. We're sorting through some IT issues, microphones, batteries, modern living. So this is a work session today. Today is the 19th of January, 2024. We're starting right now at 10:47. This is a work session on 2024 property appraisal annual valuation report. So we'll go ahead with introduction, starting with Mr. Johnson.
Zach Johnson.
Kevin Cross.
Karen Bronga,
Scott Myers.
Raleigh.
Meg Zalatil is here in the back room, and then Christopher Constant.
George Martinez.
Jack Adamus, Municipal
Great.
Assessor.
Thank you. So every year we get together about this time of year and get a briefing on an update to the valuation, the green. Oh, sorry, Mr. Salt on the phone. Yep, thanks.
Yeah, Randy, no.
Sorry, out of sight, out of mind. So this is the 2024 property appraisal annual valuation report briefing that we get annually, in which the tax assessor walks us through what changed over the last year and where we are today. And so this is a good opportunity for new members to ask questions that they might not know answers to, relating to how valuation happens across the various property types. And we had an interesting question at the assembly meeting the other night relating to a rezone that this really fits really well in the conversation to kind of as a specific example and paint some of the pictures. And so we might use that as a good example in some of the questions we have. But with that said, I'm going to hand the floor over to Mr. Gadamus to lead the way.
Yeah, well, thank you everyone for your time today and for the opportunity to discuss the 2024 values. So it should hopefully, it's about what I think 20 some slides here. I usually like to start off with this slide right here, which is just showing what property appraisal, what we do. At the bottom, you can see that there's exemptions and there's valuation. And so basically that's what our job is. We value property and we administer exemptions. On a year-round basis, we do look at exemptions. We also, you can see there, this next one, personal and property returns. So we do work personal property. We'll talk more about that. And also we inspect property. Our goal is to inspect property every 6 years. And then finally, you can see January 1, that's a really important date for us. That's by statute when the lien date is. And so that does kick off a series of dates. That first one is going to be that appeal period, which starts now. And we wrap that up around early June. And finally, the valuation analysis. And so when we start looking at the valuation analysis, we'll be looking at the values for 2025. So we'll be starting to set those for the following year. But for this year, so let's take a look at 2024 for this year. So we have a couple things. If you take a look at the left pie chart there, that's the total value. That's the total value of what Anchorage is worth, $54.2 billion. Certainly an increase this year, and I think that's probably going to be one of the big focuses for the presentation, is just talking about some of those increases. But you can see 60% for residential. We have about 19%, almost 20% for commercial, 6.1% for personal property. And then you see those two yellow pie slices. Those are generally going to be your fully exempt properties. So you have your 10% for most of your government property, and then your non-government's about 3.7%. So think of it like your churches and charitable. Now, if you take out exemptions, and when I say take out exemptions, I'm talking all exemptions. Partial exemptions, for example, your senior disabled vet, you're going to get the tax base, which is on the right. And so this is, Mr. Constant did allude to this a little bit as far as what the tax base is, but this basically is how the cost of government is distributed. So now you can see here about 65% for residential, about 27% for commercial, and about a little over 8% for personal property. So next few slides, I want
Hold
to.
on, before you go on, I have a quick couple questions I'm told.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll try not to touch it. Yeah, before we leave the slide, I wanted, could you remind us what personal property is here? Because I believe that's mobile homes, but please confirm. And then on the non-government, non-tax or tax exempt, can you remind us, because I know there's a limit on the number. So if you're a nonprofit or a church, there's a number on the a limit on the number of properties that you can exempt. Can you clarify that rule?
Yeah, so two questions through the chair to Raleigh. So the first question is personal property. Personal property is largely comprised of businesses and basically assets that are not permanently fixed to the building. So think of your inventory. We'll talk more about this in some of the slides coming up, but think of your inventory, think of your machinery, equipment, and so forth. We don't tax personally owned mobile homes anymore. Those were exempt back in, I believe, 2020, 2021. And so, but we are still, if you're a business owner and you do own mobile homes for business use, that is still being assessed in tax as that is a business asset, not a personal asset. So that's probably one of the big key distinctions with mobile homes. Hopefully that clarifies that question. And then you had a second component to your question, or a second piece to the question, and that was with respect to the limitation of exemptions for charitable properties. And right off the cuff, I'm not aware of anything in state statute that limits or precludes a limit on the value or the number of properties that could be exempt for that. But maybe I'm missing something on that question.
Yeah, just to clarify, my understanding was, let's say I'm a nonprofit housing organization, for example, and I own 12 properties. Are all of those tax exempt or because my understanding is there's a limit in local law. So that was the question I had.
Yeah, I'm not, through the chair, back to Bradley, I'm not aware of any limit on charitable. Charitable really focuses on the use of the property. And that's probably the biggest emphasis. So if the use is exclusively used for that charitable purpose, and there is clearly a charitable intent and purpose on that property, it will be exempt. So we look at by property specific. We don't look at it by the entire entity and say how many they have or not.
Thanks. Then I was just mistaken. Thank you.
Mr. Cross.
Thank you. And I want to build off what Anna just asked, and I guess in a different perspective, is that some nonprofits, religious organizations, they don't have typical business license like you would have. And so my question is, how well are we monitoring those properties that may have had exemption at one point, but no longer qualify because they were no longer being used under their exempted status? So, and I've seen this in real estate, a house that was converted to a church and then converted back to a house and still has the exemption status out there. So, I mean, and I guess, is that just an inconvenience, or is that we consider that a significant problem? Or, I mean, I'm just kind of curious how many of these properties are receiving these exemptions that may not qualify, and whether or not that's on our radar to address, or if it's just an anomaly. Thank you.
Yeah, through the chair to Cross. I think your question, quite frankly, is probably $1 million question right now for us. Our goal is to further evaluate a lot of these churches, the charitable, the nonprofits for that. We are doing some of those right now, but with the staff that we have at this time, we're limited. Fortunately, though, we will be looking to expand, and we are looking to be doing that. That can be a big challenge, though, to reveal those. They do require a significant amount of resources to reveal a lot of these exemptions.
Yeah, it would be impossible to do without a site visit, I imagine, and the manpower and that is just time consuming. But thank you.
I have Mr. Salt in the queue and then Mr. Johnson, and I'm going to have to hew us back and let him make his presentation. Otherwise, we could ask questions for the whole hour and not get through it. So, but I'll go through Mr. Salt and then Mr. Johnson, and then we're going to get back on track.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Compton. So real quick, I'm doing fast math here. The difference between the two values, 64.2 to 39.5, is roughly 15 million. Yet it seems like we're pulling out it seems like that delta is a greater percentage than what we've lost in government, non-government. Am I missing something, or is the math right?
Yeah, through the chair to SALT, it's about $14.7 billion is what we have for total exempt value. I do have a couple of slides, one in specific that can show you where that $14.7 billion resides for the exempt value. So hopefully that will better answer your question and clarify some of the overall macro data that we're looking at right now.
Yeah, it's just related to the, you're pulling out 10.4 and 3.7, yet the value of that 14.7 is roughly 27% of the 54 billion. So you don't have to answer it. I know we got more punched on time, so I just want to make that point.
Mr. Johnson.
Yeah, thanks. I'll try to be quick and I'll try to make this the only question / point I make. You said that there are properties that probably should no longer be eligible for exemptions, but due to staff limitations, you're not able to go out and assess that. Is that due to vacant positions or just generally structurally not enough staff in your office? And then the other second part of that question is, can you kind of frame that at all in terms of, you said it's $1 million question, but I mean, is it fair to say that there's a lot of money being left on the table because we don't have the people to go out and do this work? I'm just trying to think about the cost benefit analysis here, where if we don't have enough personnel, how much taxable revenue are we not able to capture?
Yeah, through the chair to Johnson. So there's a couple of questions within that. I think this discussion of exemptions certainly can be an onion with respect to everything. So when I say the $1 million question, right now, I'm happy to say that we will be having a staff that will be dedicated here in the near future. We've been working on this for quite a few months now, and we just have it approved to go ahead and start focusing on exemptions a little bit more with those resources. So I'm really excited for that. And so that question of what we need to focus on, where we need to put our efforts first, I think that will start to unfold here very soon. And so right now I can't answer that question, because at the end of the day, in order to answer that question, you have to actually look at each one of these applicants and really start to understand it a little bit more. I can tell you though that we have had significant amount of success with respect to reviewing residential, senior, disabled vets. Again, it can be very challenging and it can be very emotional for property owners, especially when we're looking to remove an exemption. That's tough. That's, our at the end of the day, our goal is to ensure that property owners who qualify receive an exemption, and property owners who don't qualify don't receive the exemption. And I think it goes to so maybe there's a second component to your question, which is really the revenue from that. I think when we look at property assessments, so if you look at that pie chart here on the right, as I kind of mentioned, and I'll emphasize a little bit more, at the end of the day, this is how the cost of government's distributed, right? And so if we remove exemptions or add exemptions to it, largely it's just going to shift rather than generate additional revenue.
Yeah, thank you.
Right, and folks can still ask questions. I just need to move us along. So just let's try to let them do that, but don't feel like you can't ask anymore.
Okay. I can also try to be fast too, if you really want. So looking at that tax base again, so that pie chart we just had on the right, here it is looking at nominal dollars spanning from 1984 all the way to 2024. The biggest thing here is real property. Has increased from 2023 to 2024 by about 8.6%. So we'll definitely talk about that a little bit more. Personal property filings are not due for personal property until April 30th. So we really won't know what happened for 2024 until later this year. But I can tell you that it was very interesting from 2022 to 2023, personal property increased about 9%. So we found that to be very interesting. We'll talk a little bit more about that. How was it? It could be.
No, it's the mic.
It is. Okay. Okay. Is this better? So again, the same pie chart, the tax base. Let's take a look here. This is going to look at a little bit more detail of that tax base, that same 65, 27, and 8%. At the top here, you can see real property residential. The main story here, $20 billion for single family homes. I think really this highlights that we're a single family home municipality. $20 billion. When you look at commercial, it's a little bit more flat. I mean, industrial, $3.1 billion total. We have a lot more industrial, so that can be a little bit misleading when it comes to like average, by property. And then hotels is the lowest at, about $0.6 billion worth of hotels. When you look at personal property, again, the focus is business here, $3 billion in business. I also have put oil and gas here. The reason for that is that can tend to be volatile from year to year, and it's also assessed by the state of Alaska. This is usually going to be property that's destined to the North Slope, that's oil and gas property. It just happens to reside here in Anchorage as of that January 1 lien date again, right? So that's a big important thing for us. Okay, I believe it was Salt that was asking a little bit more about exemptions and the breakdown. So here we are, $54.2 billion total value, $39.5 billion for taxable value, basically about $14.7 billion is exempt. And you can see here, I have it broken down by two categories. The first one, state. This is mandatory by the state statute. And the first one, you can see there's senior disabled vet, $3.2 billion for that. We saw about a 7% increase from last year at this time. We have about 21, almost 22,000 senior disabled vet exemptions. The next one's handful, municipality, education, federal, state. Again, those are going to be your fully exempt government entities. And then as we talked about, you got your charitable, religion, nonprofit, hospital, and other down below. Now, optional, if you take a look at optional there, that's local. That's what we as a municipality chose to adopt. And the big one here, residential, almost $3.8 billion for residential. And we do have quite a few of the residential exemptions, a little over 50,000 residential exemptions. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. And then we have a few other optional exemptions, personal property. We have the subdivision that's relatively new. We have community purpose, and we also have the economic development exemption as well. So here we're looking at the total exempt value for the residential exemption, and that 3.7, almost $3.8 billion. So the exemption actually started, I believe, was introduced back in 2005, tax year 2005. It started with a 10% up to $20,000. And you can see the growth is relatively flat from an actual count or value. But then you can see that we've had some clear jumps. And you can see that we had the 2018, we had the change in policy from 20% to 50%. So that really jumped it up. And then just last year, that got also increased from 40% up to $75,000 from that. So here we're looking at new construction and assessed values. So let's get into the first slide, which is looking at the new construction. So this chart here is spanning from 2006 to tax year 2024. You can see there we had quite a bit of new construction. That the line shows the total combination of residential and commercial and new construction. But you can see we had about 600 million and that dropped way down. And it's been kind of hovering around as you can see, the 150 to $200 million mark. For this year, for 2024, the overall, it's up about almost 40%, about 38%. But you can see the big story here. If you look at the detail, it's really commercial. Commercial's up over threefold compared to last year. We had some pretty big projects. It's not uncommon to see commercial kind of jump from year to year just because there'll be a project that takes a while to come online. A couple of them, we had Key Bank. I'm sure you see they've made some considerable progress this last year. West Diamond, U-Haul, Down by Diamond Jewel Lake, we have the Alyeska that had some activity. There's the Block 69. And we also did some airport stuff. We had some FedEx sorting facility. And we also had a new hangar at Merrill Field. And if you look there, basically residential, it had almost no change. Pretty much flat. So taking a look at the property summary of the overall here, we got about a little over 87,000 properties for residential and 9.7% increase when you're including new construction. If you take out new construction, it's about 9.3. We'll talk a little bit more about that. When you look at commercial, we increased the total taxable value by about 3.4% as the total value. When you look at the average by property, it's about 2.5 for commercial. Personal property, like I mentioned, is using last year's numbers, but again, that was up 9%. So I'm going to dive now into just taking out new construction and looking at the existing real estate. So residential value change here. We got a couple of things going on. We have single family homes up about 9.2%. Duplex, triplex about 8.2, condos up similar, about 9.4. And residential land, we kept relatively flat this last year. Now, when you look at the bottom here, this bottom table shows the value change by assembly district. And I think, if anything, for a message here that things are going up relatively homogeneously with about a less than a 1% spread, as you can see, ranging anywhere from about 8.7 to about 9.5%. The one probably note here to make is that higher end homes did go up about 1% more than that 9% average. They're about 10% overall for that. But
Jack, just a quick note. The label for District 1 could be updated to North Anchorage because of the reapportionment change.
that is actually, thank you for that. I certainly will do that.
You could say north of Anchorage. It would sound an awful lot like North Anchorage, but it just spans all the way to Turpin. So my friends over at Turpin might not feel like they live downtown.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. So valuation cards, we'll talk more about that towards the end, but hopefully I received my green card, and yes, the assessor increased my property as well. I was not.
That guy's a real jerk.
I know. But when you look at the market forces, so basically that 9% increase, right? Like it makes, I'm sure you might be getting questions from your constituents of how, why, what's going on. And so there's a couple of things that we were seeing from that for a couple of things. So again, 9.2 for single family, up 9.4 for condos. And I would say for what we've been seeing is that a significant portion of this year's increase can be attributed to recent market activity. Some of the increase, just to be clear, is also an effort to catch up with the market conditions too. So that 9% doesn't reflect just the market activity that we've seen in the calendar year 2023. It's probably a combination of 2022 and 2023. But at the end of the day, values, when what we're seeing in the market, again, as the assessor, I'm required by state statute to get to market value. It comes down to a simple economics, supply and demand. So when you look at the demand side, you can see here, first one, interest rates are up. And yeah, I would say that interest rates probably did suppress some demand, but overall, demand's been relatively strong. The price of substitutes, things are quite frankly not getting any cheaper. Condos, what we have seen is they have really increased this year market-wise. And I think some of that is just, again, looking at substitute. People probably prefer single-family homes, but they're starting to look at what the cost is of that. They're looking at their monthly mortgage and saying, well, what else can I afford? And increasing rents. Rents in 2022, they increased about 15%. 2023, they increased about another 5% for the average two-bedroom apartment. So again, you have to live somewhere, and when you look at the substitutes for that. And at the end of the day, too, positive economic indicators. Our job market, I mean, our unemployment, we're, for when you're looking at statewide, 4.3% unemployment. We have job openings near an all-time high. State GDP is up almost 5%. Wages are up, again, state level, about 6.5%. And so I think some of those indicators can show and have a flow of a relatively strong demand. Now, when you look at the supply side, I would think, in my opinion, if there's anything from this slide they can get, supply is at incredibly low right now. I don't know if anybody has looked at purchasing a home recently or have constituents that come to you and have heard anything about the challenge of finding a home. But at the end of the day, we're at pretty much an all-time low of inventory from that. And I think there's a couple of things for that. I've heard from some realtors that we're in a, quote, holding pattern. So again, interest rates are up. That might suppress demand, but at the end of the day, interest rates also have probably been causing potential sellers to stay put. If you have a 2.5%, 3% interest rate on your existing loan, and you start shopping around and realize that what you can afford is actually a smaller home, there's probably a likelihood that you're going to stay put. And we've also, for a long time now, seen little new construction. And when I say little new construction, what I'm really trying to say is that the demand for housing is continually outpacing the new supply that we're providing.
This probably has a question.
I'll keep it brief. So in the rental market, they always say, a 5% vacancy rate is a healthy indicator. I'm wondering if you have, and I know that's a different indicator, is there a range or kind of a healthy benchmark in terms of annual increase in assessment? Whether it's, because I know we're looking at 9%, obviously it varies. Is there, just within the industry that you work in, is there kind of a standard where you would hope it wouldn't go above a certain amount, or is there anything like that?
Yeah, through the chair too broadly, there really isn't. So yeah, when you look at the vacancy, it's hovering right around 4% this year. But when you look at the increase of prices and what's sustainable, what's not, what's a good metric, I haven't really heard of anything. I can tell you that I read a research paper some time ago that looked at the 100-year history of homes and their price and how that relates. And what that paper found was that the home values kept up with basically the rate of inflation over the 100 years. Now, there's been a couple of unprecedented things. This paper actually came out, I'm going to date myself here, but came out before the pandemic. And so what we've seen since the pandemic, not just from Anchorage, not just from Alaska, but from nationwide and quite frankly, worldwide, with a lot of rich OEDC countries, is that property values have significantly spiked. And I would say it's safe to say it's been outpacing inflation at this point in time. Where that goes, I don't know. We're just simply observing that.
Mr. Myers.
Does that 4%, thank you, does that 4% include commercial? Is that across the board or is that just residential?
That 4% through the
vacancy.
chair to Myers, I believe that 4% is looking at the basically commercial, so apartments and so forth. I don't think it's looking specifically at residential, single family homes or anything.
Okay, 4% just in commercial then. Okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
So one of the things, so I want to get into 2 more slides for residential, and then I will talk a little bit about commercial. But so again, what we observed, supply and demand, we talked about that a little bit, but here's some data as well. So we do use data. First one I want to talk about here is the number of listings. So we track listings, but we don't directly value with listings. We saw about a little over 1,100 listings that we tracked this last year. And then the number of sales inquiries we sent to seller, I got a little asterisk here. So I always like to point this out. We're a non-disclosure state, meaning that you don't have to disclose your home to us. And so we sent about 48, almost 4,900 letters to the seller. Now, we also sent them to the buyer as well. So we actually sent about 97, almost 9,800 letters this last year. And of that, we received about 456 back for 2023. So we got, our disclosure rate is, it's less, about 9%. You also include your 20, so we also use 3 years of sales as well. We have 2022 and 2023 sales. And so we use about a total of about 5,900 sales. And of those, when you look at the average assessed value to the average adjusted sale price ratio, it's about 95%, meaning that on average, if you sold your home for $100, we assess your home for about 95 cents. And I'll go on, I have a few more ratios here just to show you guys as well, looking at different metrics. So this one here, the ratio is the average assessed value. So this is just 2023 here. We're not using prior year data here. So the average assessed value of those listings divided by the, or the average assessed value of listings that we have divided by the average list price, we're about 88% of that. So again, if you're listing your property for $1, we're assessing it about 88 cents of that. The middle one, which is bold, this is one of our bread and butters. This is of those 500 plus sales that were disclosed to us, we're at 95%. And then the bottom one is more just of a metric for us. We track it. I don't put a lot of weight on it, but if you look, we have the average assessed value of a single family home. So that's total average, 450,000 divided by the MLS, average sale price, we're about 93%. So this is, again, after we increase values by about 9%. And I think if anything to take away from this is that at the end of the day, we're still being relatively cautious, even with that 9%. I would just want to make sure if there's anything that we're not taking that lightly, 9%. And we understand that can really cause some frustration, some questions with the public, and we don't take those lightly. Next, moving on to commercial. So commercial, we have, as we've already briefly alluded, various types of commercial property. Overall, we're looking at land, we're increasing about 2.8. Industrial, probably the strongest market segment of commercial here. What we've been seeing for industrial is relatively low vacancy rates. Asking rents, we've also seen increase slightly. As a result, we've been looking at about a little over 4.5% increase for industrial. Fourplex office, about 2% increase. Office is certainly one where we're looking at very closely for the coming next couple of years, where the overall vacancy and rental rates have been remaining stable here in Anchorage. But we are starting to hear some anecdotal downward pressure as we are starting to see some of these leases come to expire. So again, we're really going to be watching that close. Apartments, 2.8% increase, retail about 2%, and hotels, you can see here, that's probably the big one, about a 12% increase for hotels. And one of the reasons why we're seeing hotels jump so much is maybe this slide can help us a little bit analyze it. This is looking at the hotels, the reported average room revenue by year. And when you look at this, you can see 2019 is a little shy of about $5 million for the average room revenue by hotel. And you can see COVID, the pandemic really caused a significant disruption. And we're starting to see things starting to bounce back in general. And we saw this for 2023, we saw about a 15% increase in the average room revenue for hotels. So that's certainly a bright spot where things are coming up here from that. The other thing to note here is probably some of this can be explained by tourism. Tourism, I think, is certainly coming back. I mean, if you look at the TSA, the passenger airport count was up about 9% year over year last year. Cruises are also starting to come to full capacity, and they're also up. So I think those are some bright spots. Now, personal property, we already had this question. What's really comprised of personal property? And here's some pictures to maybe just visualize that a little bit better. But we have inventory in your upper right. We got medical equipment, also specialized equipment. You have heavy machinery. Airplanes are certainly something. You got your standard office. Basically, if you can take it out of the building without permanently damaging the building, it's probably personal property if it's owned by a commercial entity. So here we go. Personal property, again, we don't have the 2024 data, but here's looking at personal property values spanning 1985 to 2023 in nominal dollars. And you can see really it's been very interesting to watch this just really jump up. I mean, we had 2021, 2.74 billion, then almost 3 billion in 2022. And then again, about 2.23 billion in tax year 2023. So I'll be very curious to see what 2024 is. I don't know if it's going to have that continued trend, but I don't know. We'll see. But when you look at the detail for personal property, here's looking at the detail a little bit more as far as the distribution of that value and where it resides and what bucket, so forth. At the end of the day, inventory, supplies, and equipment, that's basically the bulk of the value there for personal property. So add up all that, you get your total appraised value of about 3.2, almost $3.3 billion. As I mentioned, we do have, which is a optional exemption that we elected as a municipality. We have that a business personal property exemption that's $20,000 off. So of all the accounts that we have, which is about a little over 4,400 accounts, it's about $59 million in total exempt value. So you take that out, and that's where you get your total taxable value for personal property, about 3.2 billion.
I did have a question on the property tax. Ms. Alto.
Yeah, so I have some appetite for figuring out how to, over time, get rid of the personal property tax. It doesn't, to me, make a lot of sense. And I think we can look at it, and I think there will be some appetite on this body to look at other revenue sources for the municipality. So in order not to upset the apple cart quickly, or the financial position of the municipality, would really like to work at a time appropriate in your workflow of how you would recommend maybe it would be some kind of gradual off-ramp for personal property tax, starting either maybe with bigger exemptions or categorical exemptions that could, over a course of time, give us an off-ramp. If you would be willing to work with us on that, I think that would be great in the menu of options as we do consider probably in this year additional revenue opportunities. Thanks.
Yeah, through the chair too, Zalto. I'll be happy to listen to what kind of goals you have, your vision, and try to see what tools I have in my toolbox to help achieve those.
And I'll speak to the counter to that. I'm not sure that I'm there, but I would like to know, I don't think I was able to grasp from the pie at the beginning what the amount is on the taxable value by property, 35, I guess I could do the math. It's 35 billion times 8%, I guess, 8.2%. Is that an accurate methodology?
Yeah, through the chair to content, you're trying to figure out
How much we collect for personal property?
how much we collect for it.
Billion? I don't think so. That's the value of the property. That's all we collect. If we collected 3.2 billion, we'd have quite a budget. Yeah. We'd have quite a budget. So is it 8% of that number?
I mean, I think at a high level, if you wanted to just do some like spitballing, you do 3.2 billion times I think right around 90% of it's in either tax district 1 and 3, and so just times that by the mill rate, and that should get you an answer of about $54 million.
Okay, thank
in
you.
revenue.
That's good to understand the scale of what we're talking about. Thank you. Okay, proceed.
So moving on, this is the last little section, and then I don't know what we have for time here to be mindful of time, but so this year we have green cards. I don't know if you remember last year thanks to the supply chain issue last year, we had white cards with a little green stripe, but this year we did get the green card stock back from that. So we basically, I received it. I'm sure many other people have also received it. That is, again, kicking off some series of dates that are happening now. And so the first one, we already did. First one, we mailed them. So we mailed them January 12th. So right now where we're in the middle of is this 30-day informal review period. And I want to highlight this. I have green, yellow, orange, and red. And the reason why I have those three colors is if you have constituents asking about their property and having either questions and or concerns, come contact us early. So during this 30-day informal review period, a lot of questions can be resolved without having to file a formal appeal. But when we get towards the end of that, the orange, the red, we tend to ask the property owner to appeal because we are A, overwhelmed at that point in time, but B, we don't have the time to really provide a fair due process for them. And the best way to provide that due process is to ask them to file that appeal, because that will certainly then preserve their rights. And speaking of that, so February 12th, that's the appeal deadline. That's the big one to keep in mind as we are coming around the corner for that. And so once that happens, if a property owner does file an appeal, we also have in code 15 days after the appeal deadline to submit evidence. So we do have that evidence timeline. We try to be mindful of that. It's not like we don't accept evidence. If it's certainly germane to the issue, we will accept it afterwards for that. So just want to be clear on that as well. But generally speaking, what a property owner could expect is if they appeal, that we'll be working with that property owner from about mid-February on or through about maybe early May. And then we start to shift our focus to the Board of Equalization. And the Board of Equalization, the hearings typically are going to be happening in April and May. So here's looking at...
I'm going to make a pitch right there to folks. Again, we have a set of materials I think you've received where we're recruiting for membership on the Board of Equalization. Like Scott, maybe you could reach out to the Board of Realtors and push on them a little bit because they have the material.
That was my question. What's going to be the date?
Yeah, they have it.
Were they able to staff that, or are you still looking for people?
No, we're still looking for
Okay.
a number of
I'll
people.
reach back out
I
to
think we've
Chrissy.
only formally appointed one. We need about 7 or 8 more. And so I've asked the home builders, they're doing some work. I've asked the real estate board, but I think you'd be a better ask of them. And then I think I've asked 2 other groups. So we need to do our part. Otherwise, again, if we don't have members to sit on these panels, it falls to us to sit on these panels, which is the last thing probably any of us want to do. So work now to save work later. Help me get nominees so we can get them appointed and confirmed.
Thank you. So here's a chart looking at the number of appeals by the tax year. You can see this is spanning from 2004 all the way to last year, 2018. A couple of things. So we have had a downward trend back in the early 2000s. And then things have basically been stabilizing around the 300 to 400-ish appeals. A couple of notes here. 2019, we had the 700. That was largely the earthquake. So that was a big jump in work for that. And then 2023, we did have, you can see that really jumps out as a low number for the number of appeals. And there's a question from Mr.
Mr. Johnson, go ahead.
Yeah, quick question. So I'm looking back to the much earlier slide where total taxable value, and in the early 2000s, it looked like that ramped up significantly, which seems to kind of correlate with when the number of appeals went up. Am I correct in seeing that or inferring that those two numbers are corollary, that large change in taxable value led to more appeals, or is it just unrelated?
Yeah, through the chair to Johnson, I don't know. I think there's a couple of maybe factors involved. I think one of the other ones that might be helpful to understand is we also significantly revised the municipal code, the appeal process a little bit earlier. And so I think maybe what we've seen is some of that drop could also be property owners just going through the new process and streamlining that a little bit. But I would definitely not rule out your observation and whether that's correlated or causation, right? Christmas cards don't cause Christmas, but this one certainly could be that an increase in values. I can say anecdotally that we certainly, on the years that we increase values more, we certainly see more questions. There's undoubtedly that for sure.
I just want to know how you know Christmas cards don't cause Christmas. What's your data? Thank you. Sorry.
So let's go back to, so the next slide I want to show from this, so after 2018, so the 218 appeals last year, I think probably one of the reasons for that to maybe further clarify with Johnson, it kind of goes in my theory. I don't know why we have a low appeal year, but you also have to recall last year we were very cautious increasing values last year. And again, that 9% this year is probably a combination of this year, 2023's activity, and also 2022. So here we go, 2023, what happened with those 218 appeals? I often really like to show this slide for a couple of reasons. So you can see the first thing I want to point out here, settled without a Board of Equalization hearing, 80%. So about 80% or 175 appeals, the property owner agreed with our recommended value. It's not uncommon for us to reduce the recommended value, or I should say it's not uncommon for us to reduce the original value. So a good example, maybe someone says, hey, you incorrectly assessed, you said that my basement is furnished and it's not, it's just empty. We say, oh, okay. We then go and we look at the property. We have to trust, but we also have to verify. And so we take a look, say, yep, you're right. Let's revise that. We're done. Pretty simple appeal, right? We do have appeal deposits. So if you take a look at that third bullet point way in the left there, all 175 appeal deposits were returned. So I want to stress, we have a deposit, we don't have a fee. 96% of those deposits last year were returned. It's really, and the deposit varies anywhere from, I think, $30 to, I believe, $1,000, depending on the assessed value. So it's kind of like a scale. So again, 80% were settled without a Board of Equalization, meaning that we agreed with the property owner. But at times we have to agree to disagree with property owners and do it so respectfully. And so that's where you can see that we have about 20% of the appeals did go to the Board of Equalization. 4% of those last year did the property owner failed to appear at the Board of Equalization. So all of these property owners did not get their deposit back. That's largely where, typically where the deposits will not be returned. And then of the 16 or the 34 that were the property owner was present, again, it's not uncommon for us to reduce that value, the original value, even before going to the Board of Equalization. So for example, we might have a property that's worth 450 is the original value. We bring it down to about 425,000, and we go to the board recommending 425 from there. Majority of the appeals that are heard by the Board of Equalization are upheld. I think that is also something you could look at that different ways, but the way I look at that is, generally speaking, our values are reasonable when we get to the Board of Equalization. About 77% of the appeals last year that were heard by the Board of Equalization were upheld. And I believe there was a question from Branga, maybe through the chair.
Sure, thanks, Ms. Braga.
I feel really ignorant on this, but if a property has an evaluation and then something major happens to that property, can the owner then change the value? I have a constituent that just had to put a $40,000 roof on. He purchased the property 2 years ago and it wasn't caught on inspection. Could that person go in? I mean, that was a substantial payment so that property was a lower value than he had expected. Does that make sense? Do you ever change values based on something that's horrifically wrong with the property that you have to take care of?
Yeah, so through the chair too, Brong, if I understand your question correctly, basically, like what happens when there's basically a condition issue with the property for that? So I think there's a couple of things. Again, January 1 lien date, as of January 1, did the property in this case, we're using a roof as an example. Was there a significant problem with the roof as of January 1, 2024? If the answer is yes, and it needs a roof replacement, and typically when we look at roofs, it typically has to be failing. If it's not failing, but it's due for maintenance in the next 5 years, that's different than a roof that's actually failing. We're seeing water and so forth. So if we're seeing that, water's coming in, everything else, we're certainly going to make a condition adjustment on that. And I think that's well warranted. Because again, if you look at the market, again, our goal is to get to market value the best ability that we can. And someone's not going to be probably willing to pay the same for a property that has a failed roof. Hopefully that answered your question. Thank you.
Though, I think it needs to be pointed out really clearly what he said. One thing that's very important on January 1. So nothing after January 1 changes for that year, right?
Correct. And so right now what we do have, so let's say we have a fire, January 2nd, and this has actually happened before. January 2nd, there's been a fire to a property. I can't do anything about that.
Right.
But there is a disaster relief in our code. And so that disaster relief is actually a tax relief that can get around. Right now, it's fire only. It's not for earthquakes. It's not for anything else but fire, and it applies to both residential and commercial.
And we worked really hard on that, narrowing it, because it sounds great to create an exemption broadly in the case of an emergency. But if there were an earthquake and we had a major destruction of massive properties, then our city would be bankrupted. We wouldn't have a tax levy. We would not be able to operate. The police and fire would shut down. Like the cascading problems that arise from the potential. It's one to spend some time on before thinking I'm going to drive down that road. So, Mr. Myers.
I just wanted to comment on Karen's question as well, because we had this come up quite a bit when I served on Board of Equalization, and the board's view, at least at that time when I was there, if they did improve the property with a new roof, then that's seen as a capital improvement of the property. So not a lesser value. And so the same thing would happen with people with failed windows. When you put new windows in a house, you're improving the property. So the value is increasing. So if the roof wasn't changed and it was dilapidated and rotting, then that's one thing. But as soon as he puts that new roof on, he's improving it. So
next January 1, you would see the pain of that. Mr. Cross.
And I think that's why I really look forward to hearing the conversations Meg wants to have and other things, because, you know, I guess my view has always been, as a business owner, when you put capital improvements into it, those personal property, that's like an eternal sales tax. There's a sales tax year after year after year, even though the asset may be depreciating. And so, I mean, fundamentally, I think the concept behind it is flawed, and we should look at something that's a little more fair and equitable. So thank you.
Wait, the concept behind what? I'm sorry, I missed. The
The
business.
forever sales tax.
Right, I understood. So some way to manage it differently. Okay, anyone else? Ms. Brawley?
Yeah, I had a general question, and then I'm going to follow up with some more detailed questions to save everybody's pain. But my big one is, do you have it's a two-part question. Do we track the number of property owners? So recognizing that a lot of folks own multiple properties, because I'm curious about the trend. Is that increasing or decreasing? And same with sales. Do you, in the last, for the very small number that you have disclosed, do you know how many of those are, say, an existing resident who are buying additional properties? And I bring that up because, not because the assessment, program is a policy place to talk about that, but I am concerned about the consolidation of property ownership, meaning fewer people own more land and more properties, because basically that means fewer homeowners. And fewer opportunities to own property versus having to rent. And so I'm interested in that question. I don't know if you have an answer to that. We can follow up. But I also just want to note that as a policy issue in our market that I am concerned about.
Yeah, through the chair to Brawley. So the first question, do we track properties owners? We do try to look at the top 10 taxpayers in the municipality of Anchorage, and ultimately that's by property owner. However, that is a significant challenge for us. And I'll just give you a quick anecdote of why. If you have Mr. Smith and then you have Mr. M. Smith, same person, but it looks like it could be a different person. And so trying to actually, there's not really any ID to a person that would be tied to the property. And so we often will see that. And so if we were to try to track that in its entirety, that would be a significant endeavor.
Point of order, just real quick. We were only through
It's a work
11:40.
session, it's fine.
Okay, you're fine. Okay, just fine.
It's not a committee. But that we do need to wrap up. We started a few minutes late. Did you get your question answered?
Yeah.
So this is a question, or excuse me, a topic that is very significant 2 times of the year right now and when we levy the taxes. And what's significant about this time is for you to start understanding this. And some of us have been around it long enough, we understand it more, but there's always something to learn. And what's most important is for all of us to communicate right now to all of our stakeholder groups that the deadline to appeal is February 12th. Is that it?
That's
Right?
correct.
And so that they have to act now. The green card has been delivered. I got mine in the mail. So I'm going to ask Ally and the team to put together a press release, communications, and we'll get it in the next newsletter. I'll mention it in my chair's report. But for everybody, really, if you really want to help your constituencies out, right now, you make sure they understand that deadline is coming, because on February 13th, it's too late. And that's usually sometime in April, or when they get their tax bill is when they start to raise the alarm. And it's just at that point, the ship has sailed. So anything last words?
I would say the other thing, maybe just to jump in, if you are encouraging your constituents to appeal, maybe also just kind of ask them about everything as far as things go. So where I'm going with this is appeals, a lot of times people can look at their value and they can get emotional based off of that. And I can, it's intuitive. I can be empathetic to that. But at the end of the day, when we start to look at this, the values, so if someone does appeal, we're trying to be objective and look at information. And so if they have market information, if they have anything that can really help us with that appeal, it's going to go a lot smoother. So at the end of the day, help property appraisal by getting the information that can be objective for us to show us maybe where we got things a little bit wrong. At the end of the day, I do personally look at the appeal process as a great way for us to receive constructive feedback. We really actually do need the appeal process for that. So
And I would just say I wasn't encouraging folks to appeal. What I'm encouraging you to do is let folks know about this time and window, so that when they come to shout in May, you can say, I'm sorry, I let you know in January or early February when you had an opportunity. So it just covers your bases, also provides input. So yeah, I'm not encouraging people to suggest they should appeal their property tax assessed values. I just want everyone to know the window is now. So, okay, thank you. Then we will adjourn this and we'll begin back at, we'll take a 10-minute break. So we'll start at 5 till instead of 10.